Hey students of religion, it's Dr. Lloyd-Moffett outside the box here. And this week, what we're going to do for this session is continue to talk about Eliade and then look at the critique. Now let's remind ourselves the big picture. Eliade argues that humans fundamentally are religious beings. He calls that homo religiosus. That is, we are not homo sapiens, not thinking beings, but first and foremost religious beings. And religion stems out of those fundamental orientations of life with the sacred. Religion is not the result of occasional extraordinary experiences, as Otto thought, but rather daily orienting deep out there. And sacred time, sacred space, and sacred actions are all the things we do that keep us connected with the sacred, or at least it used to be. Archaic people still hold these deep connections with the sacred. It's modern beings that had lost sight of it. And so the job of the religious studies professor is to chronicle all human responses to the sacred, to do a comparative study of how different cultures throughout time and throughout place have looked at sacred time, sacred place, and sacred action, to show the different ways humans have responded to the sacred. Now, I have to say, when I started grad school, I loved this notion. What's my job? To explore the world and see the different ways they all respond to a common sacredness. But then I also sort of looked around, especially at people of my generation, and was like, it seems like people have lost that sense. Are people orienting their lives to the sacred? Are people all looking for hierophanies to fill their days? No, it sort of seems like we've lost that mystery in life. We've come to see ourselves as fancy machines that process things rather than beacons and conduits of the sacred. And so Eliade too sensed that, even when he was developing these ideas back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He thinks that the modern world has lost the sacred. It's been hidden over by layers of science and other ideas. And so the modern human has lost sight of the sacred. In this sense, modern humans have fallen, but not because of what Adam and Eve did in the garden or something like that, but by our own self-sabotage, our own reliance on science and technology. We literally have lost sight of the sacred, the things that the archaic people had to. We're blind and deaf to it. We're alienated to our nature. And if I could use an analogy, it's a little bit like how, in America, we always tell kids that they should be artists, express themselves. They should, dedicate their energy to putting their emotions into color and form. But as we grow up, we do less and less art. We are as you mature, you sort of lose that modality of relating to the world through art. And as an adult, if you just sat around and drew with crayons all day, people would get cringy around you. There's something that you grow out of, playing around with art, except for the very few. Well, I think for Eliade, that's a little bit how we are with the sacred as humans. There was a time where this was our modality of interacting with the world and with each other, and now we've lost it. We've matured out of it. And so for Eliade, this is his problem. He says, my essential preoccupation is precisely the means of escaping history, of saving myself through symbol, myth, rites, and archetypes. That is, to go back to the orientation to the sacred that archaic people had, to not lose touch with it. And so for him, note that what we've lost, the mechanism by which we've lost sight of the sacred is symbols and myths. And so I want to spend a little bit of time here sort of exploring this notion of symbol and myth as Eliade has come to understand it. Let's begin quickly with definitions. Symbol is just when one thing stands for something else. We see this all the time. The flag, the American flag, stands for America. The cross stands for Christianity. Symbols are something part of it. Myths, well, we tend to think of them as fables now, but we will say it's a story that reveals a truth. And here's what Eliade argues, that the sacred itself is so great, so grand, so beyond human comprehension that our rational, scientific, technological mindset could never encapsulate it. We are not going to be able to conceive of that thing that made the 100 billion galaxies. We are not going to be able to conceive of that thing that has guided humans and the cosmos for billions of years. We are never going to be able to understand whatever power is behind that thing that gives life to everything in the world, that thing that designed the billions and billions of cells that we're made of. That thing is so great, no matter what you call it. Our limited human mind will never be able to encapsulate it. And that realization should spark awe, a little bit of fear, but reverence and mystery to it. And so what we need to do is remind ourselves that there is the sacred. And symbols and myths are uniquely situated to do that, because a symbol points to something without limiting it. So a symbol can point to the sacred. It opens windows without claiming to fully capture it. It's sort of a marker of something great. And so when we really embrace symbols, we realize that everything in our human plane is going to fall short of capturing, encircling what the sacred is. So symbols point to what is real, what is amazingly big and beyond us, without claiming to fully comprehend it. And so for Eliade, the West and the modern world has lost sight of this role of symbols. Instead of saying, I'm going to use this symbol to point to a reality that's beyond human conception, we try to go 12 rational proofs for God. We try to say, hey, here's the technological understanding of why the neuroscience of our brain can do X, Y, and Z. And when we see symbols among archaic people, the Northwest Native Americans or Indians use a totem pole, we go, oh, isn't that sweet? Oh, that's such a nice thing. I think I'll put it on my backyard with some prayer flags. And instead of realizing there's something powerful about a symbol for divinity, no matter how it's conceived, because it points to a reality that is far bigger than that. So symbols are needed to reacquaint us with the idea that there is a sacred out there, but it's just so much bigger than our mind can comprehend. Likewise with myths. We tend to think of, oh, that's just a myth, as a fable or a false story. We assume if it didn't happen historically, it's not true. Eliade questions this assumption. And the original meaning of the word myth in Greek, mythos, meant not that which is false, but rather that which is really true. A myth was something that conveyed an absolute truth. So what was true was not necessarily what could be historically documented, but rather to be able to convey the things of reality through a story. And let me give you a couple examples of this. So, some of you may know the story of George Washington, the cherry tree. It goes something like this. George Washington comes home one day from school. He chops down his family cherry tree. His dad comes home and says, "Did you chop down the cherry tree?" And George Washington says, "Sir, I cannot tell a lie. Yes, I did." So, he has integrity. Now, we know that story did not take place. It was invented in the mid-19th century by a preacher who wanted an example for a sermon. Yet, why do we keep telling this story to our children? Why is it in books when we know it's not true? Because somehow that story of George Washington the cherry tree reveals who George Washington was, a man of character, a man of integrity, who may screw up, but he's going to own his mistakes. And so we pass that myth on because it reveals who George Washington is. And here's the fascinating part. In many ways, it reveals who George Washington is more than what happened on that day that he's said to have chopped down the cherry tree. Because, what did he do? He probably went to school, went home, did his homework, went to bed, whatever, right? That didn't reveal George Washington's character. A myth reveals what is really true about who George Washington is. Let me give you a second example. When I was in college, I was very into the Vietnam War, trying to understand it. And as a film studies major, we did a lot of work on the Vietnam film genre. And one time, one of the great writers of America, Tim O'Brien, came to our class. And he writes a lot on Vietnam. And since it was a class on history, literature, and film in the Vietnam War, we asked him what film best represented Vietnam. Now, he had been a soldier there. Many of his works were autobiographical about the Vietnam War. And so he knew what it was like to be in the Vietnam War. And at that point, Platoon had just come out, which was a very realistic film. And I think most of us thought he would probably say Platoon was the most like what it was like to be in Vietnam. But instead, he said the Russian roulette scene in The Deer Hunter. Now, if you don't know that scene, in a movie called The Deer Hunter, there's a scene in Vietnam where an American soldier is captured by the Viet Cong. And he is forced to play Russian roulette. That is, to take a gun, put a bullet in the chamber, spin it around, and then just keep clicking his hand until he blows his head off. It's a form of psychological torture. Now, it's an extraordinary scene. But our history professor stopped him and said, Tim, how is that most like Vietnam? Because we know that never happened. There wasn't a single instance of the Viet Cong forcing American soldiers to play Russian roulette. And Tim O'Brien said, yes, it may never have historically happened, but that's what it felt like to be there. That is to say, that sometimes something that didn't happen better captured the truth of the experience than something that did. It was more real. It was more true. And that is the initial understanding of myth. Myths are things that convey realities that are true regardless of what happened, or maybe convey realities that are even more true. So think of it this way. As one author said, the truth is not distorted in a myth, but rather a certain distortion is used to get at the truth. Myths are truths that never were and always are. Another writer said, myths are the lies we tell ourselves in service of a greater truth. Myths are coded vehicles for transmitting deep truths to people. And so what this understanding of myth does is it decouples the sort of conventional understanding of what is true. Because we tend to think, did it happen? If it did happen, then it's true. And what this understanding of myth says is maybe some things didn't happen, but are indeed true. And this is what Eliade wants to get at by recapturing the power of myth. He says modern humans have lost the ability to use myths to capture truths that cannot be encapsulated by code or by reason, rational, logical proofs. There's got to be a vehicle to convey the sacred that has been lost. And myths and symbols are that way. And we kind of understand this. Think of, when Robert Frost says something, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. That very sentence, this image, this symbol, conveys a reality that so many more precise words may not be able to capture as well. Or Maya Angelou says, I know why the caged bird sings. That symbol, that story conveys some deep truths about the experience of African Americans in our history. And so symbols and myths for Eliade are the tools by which we capture reality. And we are blind to that. Now, let me give you another example from my own life. So oftentimes I am giving tours of different religious buildings. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about Orthodox churches is the entire building is set to be a symbol. I'll go through this quickly, but this area in the front that's all gold, that's supposed to represent heaven. And so everything in it is gold and silver. Everyone inside it is wearing a robe. At the other side, the narthex is this area that is a boundary spot between the secular world and the sacred world. And so the narthex is where you're allowed to have small conversations. And then the nave, the middle, is where heaven and earth meet. Up above the nave in an Orthodox church is supposed to be a dome, and at the top of the dome is an image of Christ. And then the four corners of the dome are dedicated to the four writers of the Gospels, because the Gospels in Christianity hold up heaven. And so there is both a horizontal axis by which you encounter heaven and a vertical one. And when you're a parishioner in the Orthodox Church, you are walking into this symbol of the sacred. Or at least Eliade, remember, who grew up Orthodox, says that's how humans were supposed to be. And the problem for Eliade is we have lost sight of the power of myth and symbol to connect us with the source, the sacred. Whatever that's called. You want to call that God, that's fine. If you want to call it the flying spaghetti monster, if you want to call it, whatever it is, humans have lost that connection to the sacred. And so, the terror of modernity is the loss of connection between the everyday human and the sacred behind everything. And the diagnosis is, first and foremost, because we have lost the power of myth and symbols. And so for Eliade, there is something meaningful and real behind religion. Prose, rational proofs will never capture it. And so humans have spent their entire history trying to connect with that things. And Eliade gives us language to connect to the sacred and an explanation for why modern humans seem to have lost that connection.